Welcome, everyone. We're here for our time period 6 brief review as we get closer to the Advanced Placement United States History examination. This time period will cover from 1865 until 1900. Let's get right to it. Author Mark Twain referred to this time period as the Gilded Age. He did so because to him it appeared as if there was tremendous wealth on the surface, but beneath there were problems, both economic and in working conditions. So the Gilded Age is often considered a time where the rising gap between the rich and the poor existed, and the role of government during this time was a more laissez-faire philosophy. But we'll analyze that a little bit more in detail as we get to the end of this time period. So, for 1865 to 1900, we will see the rise of big business. We will also see the growth of labor unions with mixed results in terms of its success. You will see the rise of urbanization in America. Cities will develop and grow, coupled with an increase in immigration, mostly from Europe. We will also have to talk about the settlement of the West as people decided to move and take advantage of some of the offers that the government made. As people moved further west, there will be further conflict with Native Americans. And we also have to now take up from where we left off with Reconstruction and now talk about what Henry Grady referred to as the rise of the New South. So these are the key themes during this time period in the late 1800s, late 19th century. So let's start with the rise of big business. These men here are the most known: Cornelius Vanderbilt in the railroad industry, Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan in banking. And these four men are either considered captains of industry if you believe that they were very impressive in the way they amassed their wealth, or robber barons if you believe that they used unethical means. But please keep in mind that they did not break any laws, mostly because there were no laws really regulating big business at the time. So you might remember reading Gospel of Wealth in English class. Andrew Carnegie really believed that wealthy individuals had an obligation to donate money to charity, to be philanthropic, but he still supported that laissez-faire philosophy. So even though he is very much concerned about helping those less fortunate, it would be more voluntary as opposed to forced by the government. And the concept of social Darwinism permeated throughout this time period. That's really the concept that survival of the fittest is going to be extended to your economic situation. So there, in a capitalist system, there will always be the haves and the have-nots. And there was one attempt to break up monopolies by the government in 1890. This was the Sherman Antitrust Act, but it was not successful. As a matter of fact, initially it was used to break up labor unions. So that is a nice little brief overview of the big businessmen. Of course, I'm not going into tremendous detail because we called this brief. So now we have labor unions that are going to develop at this time, and one of the most successful ones early on was the Knights of Labor. However, the Knights of Labor really incorporated all workers into its union, and that made it a little bit difficult because they do have different objectives, workers from different professions. The American Federation of Labor forms a little bit later, and that's when they will start to break people up along the craft or the skill that they employed. This was obviously a response to poor working conditions. Most of their concerns are going to be better wages, better working conditions, and shorter hours. And then two specific events that really, I think, typify the labor unions during this time period. One would be the Haymarket Riot. This started out as a simple protest by the Knights of Labor in Chicago. Unfortunately, someone, most likely an anarchist, threw a bomb leading to the death of some policemen, and 7 of these anarchists were arrested. The end result of this riot is that the Knights of Labor, even though it was most likely not responsible, was blamed for it, and it led to their demise. Then you have the Pullman strike. This one I like for you to know a little bit more detail. George Pullman had a railroad palace car company where he was building sleeping cars. He also had a little town for his workers to live in. And in 1893, a panic hit. This economic panic obviously led to a decline in the economy. George Pullman had to lower their wages which is understandable, except for the fact that he kept their rent the same. And in most bad economic times, the rents should go down if the economy is poor. So Eugene V. Debs was the leader of this union. Later on, he's a socialist who runs for president, but at this time he starts a strike, shuts down about 60% of the railroad traffic, and it was not until President Grover Cleveland called in, he got a court injunction and called in uh, the belief, no, did not call in the military, but got a court injunction to force the workers to go back. His argument was that it was interfering with the mail, and that was a federal offense. So that's it from me for labor unions. Now we'll go to urbanization and immigration. The urbanization issue, as you can see, there were tenements that were poor living conditions. As immigrants did come to the United States, many of them lived together, forming ethnic ghettos. Also, there is going to be a widespread corruption during the era of urbanization. You might recall Boss Tweed and how he was stealing money from the treasure, from the Democratic Treasury, using that money then to pay off immigrants for his votes. Central Park was built during this time to give people a place to go to escape the hectic nature of the city. Subways, I believe Boston was the first city to have a subway. Skyscrapers, obviously, to utilize space better. And do not forget that Ellis Island was the first stop for the European immigrants as they were inspected and had their names sometimes changed and had checks for illnesses. What I did not put in this frame, but you should also be aware of, is that in 1882, the United States issued the Chinese Exclusion Act, which restricted all immigration from China. Okay, we're now going to go to settlement of the West. So we have same time period, but we're thinking in a completely different direction. And really, in 1862, the Homestead Act is what sparks this mass movement. It is offering people 160 acres of free land as long as they're willing to farm it for 5 years. And that does last for several decades. So this is not a one time deal. Many of those people will obviously work as farmers. So, what problems did farmers face at this time? Well, it was a very difficult condition. Number one, if they had any type of problem with insects, that would destroy their crops. Number two, any type of drought would set them back tremendously. Number three, the new machinery that was being developed was very expensive, so the high cost of machinery was a problem. Number four, if they did want to borrow money from the banks were charging them very high rates. And then number five, which they would argue was probably the most difficult problem for them to overcome, if they did want to sell and ship their goods, the railroads were charging them very high shipping rates. You put all those problems together, and the farmers feel as if neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are addressing their needs. This leads to them forming the Granger movement. The Granger movement was on the local level, no further up than the states. And the Granger movement did succeed in getting some states to regulate the railroads. But later, the Supreme Court's going to declare those laws unconstitutional because they can't regulate train traffic from one state to another. So the federal government again makes an attempt. This time it is the Interstate Commerce Act. But just like the Sherman Antitrust Act, it was weakly worded and poorly enforced. So ultimately, you are going to see the rise of a third political party. This will be called the Populist Party, also called the People's Party. And over there, you have a 36-year-old fireman named William Jennings Bryan, who gave a speech in 1896 that is referred to as his Cross of Gold speech. One of the major parts of the Populist Party platform was to add silver to the currency. And in doing so, William Jennings Bryan, who was a Democrat, also supported that agenda. So the populists took it upon themselves to support him, but he did not win the election. What is the big impact here? Oh, by the way, he lost to William McKinley. The impact here is that the Populist Party set the foundation for the progressive movement the next time period when the government does start to get more involved in solving the problems. So the long-term impact of the Populist Party is it was a third political party. It did not have an impact significantly while it was around, but long term, it did influence actually both parties, which did take some of the causes from the populist platform into their own platform. Okay, Conflict with Native Americans. This book by Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor, really chronicles all of the mistreatment that Native Americans endured on the frontier. So our policy started out as being on reservations for Native Americans, but that really was not successful. The Native Americans prefer to live a very nomadic life with minimal restrictions. The Battle of Little Bighorn is the one conflict where the Native Americans enjoyed a victory. That was the end. That was called Custer's Last Stand. Chief Joseph, remember, he dies of a broken heart, being separated by his Nez Perce tribe. The Dawes Act will probably be the most important thing to know. This was an attempt by the government to assimilate Native Americans into American culture. Again, similar to the Homestead Act, offering them land, but they have to take the land as individual families. And that was a problem because the Native Americans like to live as larger tribes. And the final battle is the Battle of Wounded Knee, considered the last of the 19th century major defeat for the Sioux tribe. I would also bring up in both of these slides, I feel like this is something that could come up on the test. Remember the name Frederick, I should probably stop clicking that. Remember the name Frederick Jackson Turner. He was a historian later who argued in his Turner Frontier thesis that the true essence of what it means to be an American is to follow the experience of people out west. And his argument is that the colonists were from Britain, mostly, and brought British culture here. They brought the British identity and simply brought it across an ocean. But the true identity of an American, he would argue, is the experience out west. He also believed that the frontier was fully settled by 1890. All right, and then our last topic for this time period is the rise of the New South. So this man, Henry Grady, argued that the South was going to catch up economically to the rest of the country following Reconstruction. But the fact of the matter is that it did not happen, probably because they were still restricting and denying rights to African Americans. So the Jim Crow laws, I believe the first one was about 1880, maybe 1881, are strictly segregation laws. And segregation took place in all public facilities. As far as voting restrictions, even though the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote, they had to pay a poll tax, they had to take a literacy test, and grandfather clauses which exempted white people from both the poll tax and the literacy test. So this is another way that blacks were discriminated against. There are some historians that make the argument that the post-Civil War era was actually worse for African Americans, and one of the points that they would use is the conditions of the situation of lynching, public hangings of African Americans all throughout the South. Ida B. Wells was one of the muckrakers that exposed that. And then we have the two leading African Americans at the time, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington, remember, first African American formally invited to dine at the White House. Du Bois, first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard. Their different philosophy was that Booker T. Washington was more patient and thought African Americans should get a skill, a trade, prove their equality, whereas W.B. Du Bois was more emphatic in demanding equality, go to court, and fight this injustice immediately. And the specific Supreme Court case you should know from this time period is the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, in which Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, tried to ride in the white section of a train in Louisiana and was kicked off the train and arrested. And when he went to court, the Supreme Court ruled the famous phrase separate but equal, arguing that segregation was legal as long as the facilities were separate and equal. So that is my brief review of time period 6. Give me some credit because I did it with the NFL draft on in the background just briefly. And good luck, and I will see you guys soon.